Good evening, friends. Sean here. It's another Thiel Tuesday where I'm going to be talking about Peter Thiel's wonderful book, 0 to 1. And where I'm starting today is talking about actually the title, what it refers to, and what it means. So, when Mr. Thiel is talking about the concept of moving from 0 to 1, what he's talking about is technological progress. So, in the sort of introductory chapter, it describes two types of progress. One being represented by globalization, which is essentially increasing the number or cheapening the cost of a certain known technology or product. The example he gives is making typewriters. So once upon a time we had one typewriter, now we have 10. We can make them faster and cheaper because we do it now in China. And and that's essentially one form of progress. Now the other form of progress is what's called 0 to 1, and that's technological progress. And the example Thiel gives here is of switching from a typewriter to a word processor. So you can, I'm sure you're all familiar at some level with the difference between typewriters and word processors, whereas typewriters you might have had to fiddle around and you couldn't really choose your font and you couldn't cut and paste without using scissors and glue, and any number of a million things that you can do on a word processor. So it's a total revolution. Even though in some ways they look sort of similar. There's a keyboard. Keyboard is arranged the same way. The finished product in terms of a piece of paper with words on it looks the same. But so 0 to 1 is the type of progress that Thiel is looking for, and Thiel is focusing on, and I guess and that's what he calls technology. So I mean, there's obvious reasons for that. He discusses that essentially, if China with 1.4 billion people switched over to on the globalization model to the standard of living enjoyed by your average person in the United States, that would take a huge amount of oil, huge amount of resources, and would be a disaster, unless some form of technology can get in there to alleviate the cost of that energy and those resources, or lower them, or whatever the case may be. So it's sort of an interesting thing. He talks about sort of the history of technology, and I guess I can kind of expand on that. If you think of the human species and you think of us, let's call it 5 million years ago, we sort of emerged in some sort of standing-ish ape form. And then call it 2 million years ago, there were early tools. Call it 50,000 years ago, there's a version of us that looks pretty much like us. And, was more or less, some even in all sorts of places was artistic, where the record survives, or some good record and some that was definitely lost to time. And let's call it 10,000 years ago was when agriculture started, and 500 years ago printing press, 200 years ago the Industrial Revolution's on in earnest, and 50 years ago, 70 years ago, computers, 20 years ago, internet. And here we are. So quite a bit has changed relatively recently. But when Thiel talks about the last 70 years, those have really been marked more by globalization than by technology in certain, if you look at it in a certain light. I mean, we drive cars that are effective, slightly more fuel efficient than they were 50 years ago. They're about as fuel efficient as some were in the 70s, dealing with the fuel crisis. But our cars aren't really going faster. I guess we have electric cars. They're safer. They're better on emissions as a rule. But they're not really going faster. Whereas if it was 1960 and you're looking at today, you'd have assumed, it was sort of a Jetsons vision of the future, right? Where people were thinking we'd be living in sky cities and flying cars. Okay? But that didn't come to pass, did it? Yeah, even in the 80s, the Back to the Future 2 version of 2015 had flying cars and this and that. That hasn't come to be. And so Thiel sort of talks about that, that in certain ways, I mean, obviously we have smartphones, which are pretty epic technology, and some of these other things, the internet, but in certain ways, not a whole lot has changed. We live in houses that are heated by natural gas or what have you. Drive cars that go 70 miles an hour down the highway. And one thing I thought was funny, he mentions they looked forward to a 4-day work week, energy too cheap to meter. Now, one thing is, I think that we've actually done a certain amount of regressing in a way, because if you look at our energy bills, at least in Alberta, and I'm sure it's the same in California and a number of other places in the world, instead of energy too cheap to meter, we have energy that's pretty cheap and a whole bunch of bullshit on the bill. A whole bunch of carbon taxes, a whole bunch of transmission fees and all this other stuff that's cost more than the actual fuel. So that's a place where we could do some work. We need to trim down on some of these unproductive fees that are inherent in our society to date. That they're the opposite of progress, if you ask me. Yeah. And anyways, that's a pretty good rundown of what he's talking about in terms of the concept of going from 0 to 1. So going from 0 to 1 is inherently hard to see. If it was easy, everyone would be doing it. Whereas globalization is pretty easy to see in terms of, if you're making a product that's cheap in China, Chinese labor starts to get expensive, then you move to Burma, you move to Vietnam. We've seen with shoes and consumer goods that once upon a time were made in Taiwan or Japan, then moved to China. Now they're moving to Burma and Vietnam and India and wherever else is cheap. That's globalization, is seeking out cheap labor, in the same way that it builds up new markets, new consumer markets. And so where this chapter leaves off is a little subsection called Startup Thinking. I'll just quote right from it. New technology tends to come from new ventures, startups, from the founding fathers in politics to the Royal Society in Science to the Fairchild Semiconductor's Traders 8. Small groups bound together by a sense of mission have changed the world for the better. Can you think of any other examples of this? I think the founding fathers is a great one where they essentially got to rewrite government from scratch and got this incredible experiment that is the United States of America, and their awesome, unparalleled system of checks and balances. I'm going to take some heat for that, but I'm okay with that. What about the Renaissance, which some people have said was, the work of 100 men? Anyways, just sort of an interesting thing. That is sort of a new venture, isn't it? I think the Renaissance is sort of a pretty solid departure from the medieval time period immediately before. I mean, it always is a little gray, and when did the Renaissance really start? When did it end? But I think if we're being fair-minded and applying a standard definition of Renaissance, you can sort of see how different Da Vinci is from Giotto. Yeah, and then he also mentions, bureaucracies tend to shy away from risk, hierarchies, etc., big organizations. Now, I will tell you this, I'm living in Alberta. Right now, the smaller producers are under a whole lot of heat in our oil patch. It's just a tough go when you don't have mass and you can't, if you're not vertically integrated like Imperial and some of these guys where you can be selling gasoline at your own stores, you can be sort of exposed. But if you look back at it, a number of the great discoveries in Alberta were made, yes, by majors such as Imperial at Leduc, and the oil sands, which was essentially a government project, frankly, through, I believe it was called Syncrude. Anyways, but the fact of the matter is, like in Alberta's oil industry, and I'm sure in other places in the world this is true as well, a lot of the great discoveries in terms of if it was somebody finding a weird reef, were done by wildcatters, which were small companies that were very, very risky, often that utilized very simple ways of raising capital, such as what used to be called JCPs, Um, my dad ran one of those. There was lots of those in Calgary, which were you would have an IPO essentially at 5 cents, and you said, hey, listen, this is a risky bet on your prospectus or whatever it was, and you could lose all your money. And people were like, well, okay, I'll take the loss. I'll write off the loss. Now go drill a well, guys. And some of those did work out, and some of them found wonderful, wonderful pools, and tried new technologies and all this stuff. And those sorts of new ventures really were a very important part of the ecosystem in the Alberta oil and gas industry. They've been beaten down. It's harder to operate. You need to have economies of scale to deal with the regulation, this, that, and the other. So for my money, I'd like to see things simplify from a securities and legal point of view so that we can get more small guys out there drilling wells and trying new stuff and finding new oil and gas and finding new ways to make it cheaper and more energy efficient. So I'll leave you with that. Anyways, thank you for watching. I hope you learned something. I learned something just by thinking about it. The whole point of this, which I haven't really gone into in great depth, is about this whole book is intended to be an exercise in thinking. And I'm a guy, I tend to blow through books. I thought that I would read this one a little more intensively, that I would think out loud about it, put it online so that I have a reference point and that I have some skin in the game, and that I would try and do it once a week on Tuesdays. So here goes nothing. I'm going to keep at it. I hope that you enjoy. I hope that you did watch. And feel free to drop me a line anytime in the comments. Like, subscribe, do all that stuff. And thank you for coming on this journey with me. Have a great evening. Bye now.